So if you're just joining us today, I'll catch you up to speed really quick with where we're at. We've been working through 1 Corinthians. It's a letter in the New Testament of the Bible. It's written by a figure named the Apostle Paul, or the sent one of Paul, and he is one of the people carrying the message of Jesus from the area of Israel throughout the Roman Empire, establishing churches in a lot of different Greek and Roman towns and cities. And one of the stops along the way on his church planting endeavor was a place called Corinth. It's in central Greece, right between the southern part, the Peloponnesus, and then the northern part, the mainland, on that small strip of land that connects them. And so we've been looking at this culture for the last few weeks and at Paul's advice and comments to them. And I feel like if you had to summarize it in a nutshell, he would be encouraging the people of Corinth to exercise a lot more humility. Their culture really pushes honor and status and wealth and making a name for yourself. And it's one of the few places in the Roman Empire that actually gave people the opportunity to come in with no standing, no position, no family connections or political connections, and actually become kind of a self-made person in that day and age. So there's a lot of competition and a lot of desire to get ahead. And that has worked its way into their church as well. They view spirituality as a competition. And they're looking at other people instead of friends in a community. They're looking at other people as maybe even a hindrance to their growth and their spirituality. And it's just created a lot of unhealthy relationships. And as we've worked through this book, last week we were in chapters 4 and chapter 5. And we came across different situations after Paul lays a groundwork foundation of what humility looks like and how important it is in the church. He starts to address some specific situations and circumstances going on there. And last week we talked about a situation where many people in the church were giving their full approval of a man who was in a very sexually abusive relationship with someone else in his own family, his stepmother. And how Paul is really bringing out the seriousness of that situation, that many people culturally, there's a lot of things that are permissible in ancient Roman culture. And so some people are feeling very generous and very free by allowing certain things to be practiced, but they're things that are abusive and very harmful for people. And so we looked at some of the dynamics of how correction and consequences played out in that specific situation. And instead of just moving on this week and jumping into the next things that Corinthians has to offer us, I want to kind of pause. And this is a little uncharacteristic of me, so if you just showed up today, you're going to get a little different taste of me than you normally would. But instead of just moving on to the next thing in the next verses, I want to pause and go on a rabbit trail, because I think it's something that's so important for us to just interact with as a church. And that is the topic of correction in the church. I think it's something that, again, gets misunderstood and abused a lot of times in how we handle situations. So whether you call Mountain View your home church, whether you're exploring home churches in the area, kind of figuring out where to settle, or even investigating faith, or whether you're traveling from other places and you just happen to be here with us today, hopefully these will be things that you can take and put into whatever types of church or other community situations as you consider these things. So we're going to have a little bit of review of what we talked about last week and visit some of those scriptures, but we're also going to look at kind of the broader picture of how this operates in the church. And then what I want to finish with today are actually 12 or 13 different scenarios. I want to propose to you all as a congregation. These are based on things that are similar to what I've seen. I've worked with churches, in churches for the last 23 years. I've worked in Christian camps for about 20 years. I've worked with Christian universities for 3 years on staff. And so I've seen the Christian world, and I know how we handle things, and it's not always the best. And so I want us as a church just to step back, and hopefully this will be helpful for how we move forward and just maintain healthy relationships with each other as a church. So I think this is valuable, but it's not my characteristic self. It's just a rabbit trail that I think is so important for us to take a look at. And I want to start it out with this kind of assumption. And it's something, again, that's based on my experience, so you're completely free to disagree or feel differently. Your experience may have, brought you to a totally different conclusion, but here's my take on things. I think many churches actually misunderstand the purpose of correction because they misunderstand the purpose of humanity, why God created people in the first place. And I want to take you through the way that I've seen some churches process this in the past. It's not every church. It may not even be most churches, but there are definitely some churches, and it's been, unfortunately, the result, I think, of a lot of hurt in people's lives and a lot of mishandling of these types of situations. So let me tell you how I think some people envision it. I think some people see it this way, and some churches see it this way. God made people to follow the right rules. That's not what I think is accurate biblically, but I think a lot of people have that point of view. God made people to follow the right rules, and God is pleased when people follow his rules, his right rule. That's what makes God happy. And as a church, then a church says, and we have determined what God considers to be the right rules. We don't follow some of those Old Testament rules for Israel, but we have our kind of list of what the right rules are to follow. And of course, humanity needs forgiveness for breaking the right rules. And God's happy when we obey the right rules. So a church is defined as a community of people who are committed to the right rules. And then when people disobey the right rules, it's a threat to a local church's reputation. So the church has to police people who fail to obey the right rules. And correction becomes this ultimatum of, you have to comply with the right rules. And if you don't, we have to remove people who refuse to obey the right rules from this church community, because the church is a community that's committed to the right rules, because God made people to follow the right rules. And we know what those right rules are. And I think that's how the mental process goes a lot of times. And I want to propose to you what I've seen happen as a result of this. Again, these are my perceptions, and yours may be different. But I think that misunderstanding of what the point of people is and how the church community operates has resulted in some of these things. One, judgmental and self-righteous attitudes, because, again, that automatically puts us in a place of comparison. Well, I'm following the right rules, they're not, so I'm better, I'm more spiritual, I'm more righteous. And it kind of resembles the religious community that was operating in Israel in Jesus' day. People were doing the same thing. This is not something that's restricted to just Christian churches. I think it's something that, can, affect the mentality of religion in general among people. I think it's resulted in some unnecessary or harsh consequences in churches because people are so quick to try to do things to protect the reputation of a church being a group of people who follow the right rules, and they think it's related to God's reputation, and so sometimes they come down harshly. I think, unfortunately, in some cases it results in spiritual abuse, and you may have heard that term before. Here's a quick definition, some examples, I guess. Using beliefs to hurt or scare other people into change. This is what we believe, this is what's right, and if you don't do this, this will happen. Or using shame and guilt-tripping people, or even isolating people to try to motivate a change of behavior, because it's there's this pressure. We have to conform to God's rules because it's threatening our reputation, and so even if we have to make people feel ashamed or guilt-trip them or isolate them, we need to do whatever we can to protect, this group of people as a group of people who are obeying God's rules, the right rules, the way we interpret that. Or even forcing somebody to follow a teacher or teachings. In extreme examples of spiritual abuse, there is very maybe authoritarian figure, somebody like me who's standing up front, who's telling people exactly what God expects of them, and who's kind of putting out the agenda for, how people act in this community. I think it's also resulted in church hurt. And that's just pain that results in people's lives from being exploited, so taken advantage of in different ways by churches, abused by people in churches. Last week we talked about abuse and what that entails, and it's really, it's causing pain or harm to somebody else for the benefit of another individual or a group. And it can be financial abuse, spiritual abuse, it can be physical abuse, it can be sexual abuse. There's so many different categories of abuse, and we reviewed some of those last week. Some people are disillusioned by churches. They promise things and then they let them down. Or even abandoned by members or leaders, sometimes very quickly, again, because you don't fit the mold of what that church is about or what that group of rules is about. And I want to just offer this observation. I think when churches approach spirituality that way, it actually destroys relationships. But I think if we look at the big picture of the Bible, we notice that God is not emphasizing rules. He's actually emphasizing relationships between people. And I would propose to you that I think from Genesis through Revelation, we see a God who's pursuing relationships, right relationships with people, and a God who's encouraging those people to live in right relationships with each other and even with the natural world around them from start to finish. So maybe it's not about following the right rules to please God. Maybe it's about existing in the right kinds of relationships. And if that's the case, then perhaps the purpose of correction is not preserving and restoring rule following. It's actually preserving and restoring right relationships. So when we approach anything in the realm of correction, and I think there's a spectrum, and I'll share that with you this morning, and it's based on different principles and verses and places I've seen in Scripture, so I'll bring that into it as well. Bring the Bible into this as well. But I think correction is all about maintaining the right kinds of relationships. And if that's the purpose, if that's why correction happens in different levels in different ways, then there's an assumption. And that's that we already have relationships, close relationships, that they already exist in a church community. Between the people or the group who are offering the correction, person of the group, and the person or the group who are receiving the correction. It's very disingenuous when someone approaches you and they try to correct your life and they don't even know you, right? There is just so much that we miss. I would suggest that if we don't have a close relationship with someone, in most cases, we don't even have the right to offer correction to someone. You may have heard statements like this: you have to earn the right to be heard. People won't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And those statements have been made for a reason. Those are actually kind of, cultural proverbs because they're true to a large degree. And you can't love somebody or correct them in love, which is the form of correction that the Bible prescribes, until you know someone. So you can't love them and you can't correct them in love unless you know someone in the first place. And if you look into the life of Jesus, the more you look into Jesus' life, the more you're confronted with a person who is absolutely obsessed with living among people and getting to know people on a deeply personal level. Even with the religious leaders, and we see him confront them and we see him correct them in different ways on different occasions. But what we don't realize a lot of the time is that he is eating meals with this group of people too. And he's interacting with them constantly over a 3-year period. So it's not like these people are just coming up and Jesus is saying, hey, here's how you need to change your life. There's a relationship, even with the people who are opposing him, that's been existing, that's a lot more deep and a lot more personal than we would ever realize, let alone the people who are coming to him humbly or wanting to be his disciples or following him. So those pieces of advice are existing in the realm of relationships. And unless somebody is causing division in a church or committing abuse, I would say in a lot of cases we shouldn't even think about trying to correct someone who we wouldn't even call a close friend. Because again, correction is to preserve and to maintain and to restore relationships. And if there's no relationship in the first place, shouldn't we start there? Why are we correcting people that we don't even know? Why are we pretending there's a relationship there if there's not? And I think that's ground zero. That's where we have to start as a church, because we're not really concerned about them as a person. If we don't know them, the reason why we're offering correction might be because it makes us uncomfortable, and it might be because we're concerned about somebody's reputation or a church's reputation, but it's not really because we're concerned about somebody as a person. Otherwise, we would have taken the time to get to know them and build a friendship or a relationship in the first place. And if we don't know that person on a personal level, we don't really know their character or their circumstances well enough to give good advice. We're not really concerned with restoring right relationships. And I think that's the whole purpose biblically for offering corrective advice or comments or things of that nature in the first place. And so I think everything has to start with a relationship. And the purpose of correction is to maintain that. Now, that was some of like Jason philosophy based on my experience. So feel free to disagree. I'm just telling you what I've seen and what I think is really helpful for us to realize as a church. And I would make this statement. I don't think that correction is an ultimatum for compliance in the Bible. I think it's more of a spectrum of different kinds of responses intended to maintain relationships. And so I'm going to use the word correction really broadly here as we talk about this morning. And here are some things that I would say fall on that spectrum of correction when you look at the Bible and the principles that the Bible brings to the table in this area in general. I think one element of it is just showing consideration for people. Maybe it's stopping short of giving advice because we're just realizing we're different in different ways and we need to be considerate of our differences. And then there's another level where we approach people and we just express our concern. And then there might be another point where we have to enter a conversation and actually suggest changes, that changes be made. Because our concern and our investigation of reality and what's actually happening and our friendship again with that person, it leads us beyond that to wanting to suggest some changes, again, to keep the relationship maintained well between us and that person and the community, the church community and that person and the Lord and that person. And then there might be few occasions where even some boundaries or consequences have to be put into place. But I think those overall are few and far in between. And so what I want to do is kind of outline those different 4 areas and how I see those, just kind of an overall summary of those areas. And then I want to give you some scenarios this morning. And if you're brave enough, I'd love to get your input as to where on the spectrum of correction we should enter into those conversations. And these are going to be real life scenarios, things that I've seen in churches or close to things that I've seen in churches because it's reality. And I think it's important for us to walk through and think through how we operate as a church and how we enter into people's lives. So here's the first thing on the spectrum. And we talked about this a little bit in 1 Corinthians 4. Here's what verse 5 said. Paul was talking to the Corinthian church, and he was giving them some advice. And this is before he ever tells them to be corrective of this specific individual who's abusing someone. He hasn't gotten there yet in the letter. He's just talking about being too judgmental in general. And this is what he says. He says, "Don't go on passing judgment before the time, but wait until the Lord comes, who will both bring to light the things hidden in darkness and disclose the motives of the human hearts, and then praise will come to each person from God." So Paul's saying, don't be too quick to pull the judgment trigger on somebody, because when the Lord comes, he sees the reality. He sees the hidden things happening in people's lives that you don't. He sees the motives in people's hearts, and assuming is going to get those things wrong so many times. So if it's possible, just avoid passing judgment whenever possible. Show consideration. What does that look like? It might look like tolerating different convictions. You're going to have people who join you in a community of faith, maybe a church like this or your home church, and they're going to think differently. And these aren't things that are going to affect whether or not somebody comes into a relationship with God in the first place, but they are going to affect how you navigate life differently. Paul talks about in Romans how different people have opinions on whether or not you should eat food offered to idols. Some people have different opinions on whether or not to consume alcohol as a follower of Jesus Christ. Some people have different convictions on how you dress as a follower of Jesus, or on what kinds of music you listen to, or on there's a whole, you could come up with lists, endless lists of things where Christians might disagree on specific issues. And sometimes we just need to show each other consideration. Maybe 90% of the time, we need to just show each other consideration. And especially if you don't have a relationship with the other person, you need to show them consideration. We also, I think, need to assume good motives instead of reading something online or instead of listening to a quick comment that we overhear in a crowded hallway and saying, oh man, I don't know where they're headed. Maybe we should assume, and if we have a good friendship, we'll know their heart, we'll know their character, but assume good motives. Admit a lack of information. Sometimes in situations, most of the time, we just don't know different components. And so we have to be honest with ourselves and say, there are a lot of things in this situation that's perked up my ears, I'm aware of. A lot of things I don't know. I think we have to be careful to avoid unnecessarily offending people because sometimes, as followers of Jesus, we're so good at that. We'll say things and maybe it's good intentions, but it causes needless offense. And we really need to be careful to prevent church hurt, prevent abuse of people, prevent misunderstandings of people, prevent that judgmental attitude. Most of the time, we just need to show consideration to each other. And that's where Paul was hitting at an entry level with the Corinthians as well. But there were certain situations that required more than that. And so he also brought that into consideration. Sometimes correction involves sharing our concerns. And a scripture, if you're looking for scriptures to anchor these principles to, you're going to find different places in Proverbs, different things that Jesus says or that the Apostle Paul shares with churches. But I think one possible scripture to anchor to this might be Matthew 18. And this is where Jesus is talking to his followers, and he says, if your brother misses the target, misses the mark, sins, go and show him his fault in private. If he listens to you, you've gained your brother. But if he doesn't listen to you, take one or two more with you so that on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, every matter may be confirmed. What he's really saying is, you have a concern or you felt offended. And so go to that person personally and approach them. And if that's not effective, move on from there. Maybe there are other people that, have seen and that can establish the facts of what's happening. Maybe there's a need for more. But at a very basic level, just go and share your concern with that person. Don't talk to everyone else but that person. Just go share your concern. And part of that is just saying, hey, I failed just as much as anyone else. When Jesus is teaching his followers, he says, take the log out of your eye before you try to remove the speck out of your brother's eye, your sister's eye. And so sometimes for us, we realize before we ever say a word to someone else, we need to work on ourselves because we're just going to be hypocritical. And so we just decide to keep our mouth shut, Other times we have to approach people with the humility of realizing that we all are imperfect people trying to work on our relationships. Because that's the whole point of all this, is to preserve good relationships, treat each other in right ways. So we're going to express concerns confidentially. We're not going to tell other people. We're just going to talk to the person that we have the concern with. And again, they're going to be a friend, right? Because if they're not a friend, what right do we have to even approach someone we don't know and say, I'm so concerned? Because if we were really that concerned, wouldn't we make the effort to become a friend? Just doesn't make sense. We need to listen to other perspectives with an open mind, because sometimes when we share our concerns with people, we realize, we see things very, very differently. And just listening to how they see things, we can understand. And sometimes it's about appreciating different approaches or different convictions. I don't understand why you have this conviction that I don't, or why you don't have this conviction that I do, but okay, we're different. We see things differently. Scripture allows for that kind of room, so okay. Or you approach things totally different than I would, doesn't make sense to me. I wouldn't do it the same way, but I understand why you do it the way you do it. And so we let it go sometimes, and we let God's Spirit work the way that he's working in somebody else's heart, even though it's differently than ours. And also at this stage, we have to remember to avoid judging people outside the church. That's one thing we saw in 1 Corinthians 5 last week. Paul says, I don't judge people outside the church. God judges people outside the church. God judges all people. All people have to answer to the Lord. But it's not my responsibility to go up to people that don't even follow Jesus and try to encourage them to live like they're following Jesus. Because they're not. That's not what their life is about. So why should I impose that on someone else? And then there are times where maybe we have expressed a concern, and as we talk more and more and we listen more and more, and it's in the context of a relationship or a friendship, we realize I need to make some suggestions. I can't love this person without making some suggestions for a better change. And so before we do that, maybe we're going to have conversations with people. And this is what we see Paul doing last week in 1 Corinthians 5, the earlier part of that chapter. He is in a position where it's not just the word of one person. He's away from the situation, miles and miles away when he's writing this letter. But he hasn't just heard something from one person. It's something that's public knowledge that he's addressing. And if he were closer to the situation, I'm sure he would have had conversations with lots of people that were involved. But he's trying to figure out, what is accurate. He also talks about in 1 Corinthians 5 with that specific situation I described with the man who's abusing his stepmother, that he had processed the effects on the city, how things were impacting the city, how things were impacting the church, how things were impacting that individual, and he actually outlines that in 1 Corinthians 5, and you can read through that on your own if you'd like to see all that being described in detail. But we have to figure out this thing that I'm concerned about, this thing that I believe I should suggest a change toward, is it affecting one person? Is it affecting a family? Is it impacting a church? Is it impacting an entire city or a local area or community? How big is this thing? Because that might determine what our suggestions are. And also, is harm being done? Is it something where somebody's being subjected to an abusive situation? Because that's going to automatically ratchet up how serious this is. And maybe at this point in the process, this type of correction, we realize, I need to alert some authorities because there's a kid who's suffering abuse, or people who are being abused, adults who are suffering abuse, or there's a real threat to the unity of this church because somebody is on a mission to divide people. And so sometimes authorities mean the local police. And I've done that before. I've had conversations with police officers about people that I know have been experiencing physical abuse, or that I've heard have been experiencing physical abuse. And it's my responsibility, especially as a pastor. I'm one of those people called mandated reporters. And so I have to legally report things, even if I don't have enough evidence. The police aren't going to take Jason's word for it and say, because Jason said so, it's fact. But they're going to look into things or deal with it from that point on. And there are certain things that we are obligated, maybe by society, maybe by law, maybe by our moral conscience, to actually alert higher authorities about. And then there are some things that we see, and they're having such a major impact on a church community, again, causing divisions or perpetuating abuse, and we realize we need to speak with the church leadership. And maybe that's something that you brought into that second step of concern already, right? It's hard because you want to be as confidential as possible, but there really are things that can destroy a lot of relationships really quickly. And so there's some discernment in this. When you have a conversation, describe the harm that you perceive happening. I'm really concerned about you because I see this hurting you or hurting other people. And suggest changes with gentleness and love. There are situations where Paul is more direct and serious and forceful, but it's when people are really arrogant about their actions that are causing harm. In most cases, you can have a conversation and just say, I care about you. Here's what I would suggest. And offer to help enable change. Sometimes people need resources or encouragement or a friend to check in on them, or resources beyond what you can provide. But sometimes we suggest change. And then maybe at times correction gets really serious. And so we have to specify consequences. And in a church community, a lot of times that's going to mean consulting with leadership, because if something's serious enough to involve consequences, it's probably affecting portions of a community. And so it's something where in most cases you would need to at least get advice from, or maybe even hand it over to people in a leadership position. And these principles work outside of a church community as well, but we're just kind of today. And maybe whether it's through leadership or you personally, people who are ignoring or approving of harm need to be just have a conversation with them as well. And that's what Paul was doing with the Corinthian church, because some people came to Paul and they were grieving that this abuse was happening, and then other people were like, hey, we're so free, We're so loving, we just let people do whatever they want here in this church. And Paul was like, you've taken it too far. You're ignoring abuse, or you're even approving or encouraging abuse to happen. And that's definitely not what a church is about, because the church community is supposed to be a place where people, again, exist in right relationships. And that's, a huge threat to right relationships. So sometimes it's not just the people directly involved, it's the people on the sides who are saying, hey, it's fine with me. And then if there are people causing divisions, Scripture is pretty clear on this. In Titus 3, Paul gives this instruction to Titus, who's working with a totally different church at the same period of time. And he says, warn a divisive person, warn them a second time, but after that, separate them. And so it's this idea of if there's someone in a church who has this agenda to try to separate and divide people and relationships, firmly warn them, give them more than one chance, but this is a serious thing. And with abusive individuals, it's another, again, a very serious thing. And so as a church, as was the case here in 1 Corinthians 5, Paul decided, you all as a church community, you need to separate this man who's abusing his stepmom and also emotionally abusing his dad because of that relationship. You need to separate him from the community of people where, his survivors are a part of, survivors of the abuse. Maybe it involves discussing a process of restoration and accountability, because that could be another avenue. It's not all maybe the same level of severity. But if there are people in a church community who continue to perpetuate abuse and divide people, then there comes a point in time where correction does involve removing people. But the intention is always to separate people from a community for a time. This is where I've seen churches, I think, take things too far as well. The intention has been, again, if you're all about the rules, the intention is remove people who are troublemakers, who are rule breakers. But if your focus is all about the relationships, then you're looking for a goal. And the goal, it's always to preserve and restore right relationships. And so when people come to the point of realizing what I'm doing is harming relationships, and they desire to change, actually the same situation in 1 Corinthians 5. The book of 2 Corinthians tells us the rest of the story. There's a point in time where this individual, he's abusive, he refuses to stop, he's arrogant, and so the church says, you're not welcome in this community as long as you're going to abuse people in the community. You can't be a part of this because of the way you're harming these relationships, harming the people. And all of that eventually gets to him, and we don't know exactly how. But he comes to a point where he realizes that was a horrible way to treat people. That's not what God wants. That's not what I want. I want to change. And Paul actually had to tell the Corinthian church, don't keep him at a distance. Bring him back in, include him, and comfort him because he's ready for right relationships, which I would say is what God created humanity for, what God created the church for. Where the Bible starts, where the Bible ends. It's people existing in right relationships with God and Christ. Faith in Christ is how we enter into that with each other and even with the world around us. And that's where the Bible finishes as well. It's where it's heading. It's where this all is heading, to a beautiful place of right relationships continually in all these ways. So as we close, I want to throw a couple scenarios at you and get your thoughts. So here's your options. Show consideration, share your concern, suggest some changes, specify some consequences. What do you do? So here's scenario number one. You disagree with the way a pastor explains a verse in the Bible. How many of you would say, let's show consideration? How many of you would say, express my concern? How many of you would say, suggest that he change? How many of you would say, give that guy some consequences? All right, a couple of them. Lay the smack down. But this is true. Again, these are scenarios, and it's not always so easy. Obviously, on this one, I'm a little bit biased, but I would suggest is in a lot of situations, one, Do you have a relationship with the pastor who's sharing these things? If you do, what do you know about that person's character? What do you know about their training and their heart and all these things? It might be wise to show consideration, realizing that you can have different points of view on things, realizing that there are a lot of things in the Bible where people read it and they come out thinking different things. If it's truly concerning, do you think your pastor would appreciate you approaching him or her to have a conversation? Of course, especially if you have a relationship already. It's an easy conversation, right? Here's another one. Somebody on the stage is wearing an outfit you feel is inappropriate for church. What do? Do you show consideration? Do you express your concern? Do you suggest changes? Wear something else next week. Or do you deal out some consequences? What do you think? How many of you tend to lean on the first couple? How many of you lean on number one? How about number two? How about three? How about four? Okay. Again, there's going to be discernment that needs to be exercised. But in most cases, I would say if you have a great friendship with somebody and you're truly concerned, you can express your concerns, but also be willing to hear their side of things, right? But in most situations, show consideration. We've had very, very in-depth conversations over the years over small clothing articles like hats, things of that nature, certain types of shirts, certain types of pants worn on stage. What really is fostering right relationships? And are those things, is that piece of clothing threatening right relationships in a church? Is it really a threat to right relationships in a church? Again, if you really think it is, express your concern. If not, show consideration. Here's another one. Someone in the church community posts a comment on social media that makes you uncomfortable. What are you going to do? I mean, there's a lot of different reasons why it could make you uncomfortable. I would encourage you in most situations, show consideration because one, you probably don't know the context. You may not know the reasons why what was said was said. You may not know what something that was said actually means. You're just getting it based on how it hits you, and you're making a lot of assumptions. So I would say in most situations, show consideration. I have seen people make social media posts that I actually thought threatened the integrity of what Christianity was in the first place. For example, a few years ago, near an election, I know we can't relate to that, I saw a Christian whom I knew they reposted something that a pastor said. And the pastor essentially said, if you don't vote for a certain candidate, you're not a Christian. You're not saved. The Bible I read doesn't condition your salvation, your relationship with God, on who you vote for in an American election. And so those kinds of things, I think they really do, they can mislead people to think, if I don't vote a certain way, God will not accept me. And I think that's horribly wrong and, can affect people's eternal state with God. And so those types of things might need a little bit of concern expressed, right? But for the most part, with social media, good night. That's a huge rabbit hole. Just show consideration to people. 4, a gay couple sits down in the row in front of you at a church service. I know there are a lot of things that some of you maybe would feel less comfortable around, different people's lives, the choices people make, the ways people are. But what is the purpose of a church? It's a place where people come to know and discover God, right? And we're trying to, again, cultivate right relationships. And if we don't even take time to get to know people, because the way that they live is a way that we would not choose to live, we're really not even allowing people to get a foot in the door and come to know and discover Jesus in the first place. And you could replace a gay couple with many other cultural things that might be uncomfortable for you. But I would really encourage you to show consideration because people's lives are so complex. And we may not understand anything about where people are coming from. And it's very important to start by pursuing relationships with people, giving people an opportunity in this community to be loved and discover who God is. So I would encourage you to lean those ways, even if things or people in this church community make you uncomfortable. I guarantee you, if you spent a day with Jesus, you would feel so uncomfortable. You would be eating with people who were tax collectors, talking about ways they'd swindled people throughout the day. You'd be eating with prostitutes, talking about what they were up to the next night, and you would be so uncomfortable. But you would be with Jesus. And so I think we would benefit to take a page from his playbook in how we approach people and how we treat people who walk through the door. 5, someone in the church community shares his or her concerns about someone else in the church community or somebody on the leadership team with you. They come to you and say, I don't know, Jason, did you hear what he said the other day? I'm just so concerned. At the ladies' Bible study, did you hear about April? You know what's going on in her life right now? I'm just so concerned. What do you do? How many of you would say, show consideration? How many of you would say, share my concerns? That could be with different people, right, in that scenario. How many of you would say, suggest a change in there? How many of you would say, dish out consequences? How many of you would say, I don't know, it's kind of tricky, right? I think this is one of those things that's kind of like a sleeper cell in a sense. It seems so benign, and when you think about the implications, I've seen so much damage happen in churches because of things like this. What this is something called gossip. It might be a word that you've heard before. And gossip often is actually the fastest way to damage relationships and divide a church community or any other community of people, for that matter. And Jesus, when he talks about expressing concerns, there's this process, and we talked about it in Matthew 18, where you're approaching the individual with your concerns. And so I would encourage you, if people come to you in a church, first of all, I would encourage you not to go to other people about your concerns about this person. Go to the person that you are concerned about and express your concerns. But don't share your concerns with everyone else but that person. That will solve nothing. If somebody shares that with you, just ask a quick question. Have you actually spoken with that person to share your concerns with that person? And if they say, well, no, just make a suggestion for a change in that moment. I think it would help if you spoke to that person directly first before you shared your concerns with other people, because you might come to realize things that you're completely unaware of, and it might change your perspective on that. And perhaps if that's something that the person has no desire to do, or where you see somebody in a pattern of continually sharing things about other people without approaching those other people, maybe you should express your concerns to that person or even to church leadership, because again, it's something that can cause division and can be a lot more serious. And maybe you should keep your eye open to see if you have similar concerns. So those are ways that we might step into a situation like that. A few more and then we'll conclude today. You suspect that someone in the church community is an alcoholic, okay? This is reality. This is life, right? I mean, we have people in our room here right now who are alcoholics, former alcoholics. Like, this is just real life, right? So you suspect someone. Again, do you have a friendship with that person? Do you know them? Maybe you should approach them to express concern. Start it with a conversation, because your assumptions can be so dangerous if you don't just communicate with people. And then maybe over time, as you get to know them, they say, well, yeah, I admit, I think I have a problem with alcohol. I drink 25, 30 beers a week. Like, it's probably a little excessive. And so maybe then you can help them walk into some possibilities of how to make some positive change in their life, or connect them with some support groups. We have a women's open AA meeting here at the church on Tuesday nights. And so maybe there's opportunities to connect people with something that's really going to help them make positive change. 7, you know someone outside the church community is living with his or her girlfriend or boyfriend. And maybe you don't approve of that relationship. You feel like people should be married before they live together. But this is somebody outside the church. So Paul would tell you, don't judge people outside the church. They're not supposed to be following Jesus. They don't have that commitment to Jesus. You do. It's not your job to make them follow Jesus. Someone in the church community tells you that his or her spouse in the church community is having an affair. These are all real scenarios. Like I could tell you stories with each types of things like this, probably multiple ones. But at that point, it's affecting different things, right? Because maybe it's your friend, so you're going to talk with them personally and express your concern. But perhaps it's something that also is affecting the church community. And maybe it's something, I would say probably the best way to navigate this might be to have the person, to suggest that the person who shares this with you, if they need some additional support and help, people to lean on, that they approach somebody in leadership. A friend, perhaps, someone who's leading a Bible study, perhaps one of the elders of the church, to see if there's ways that the community can help people navigate this. I've seen churches where this would be an immediate, we're going to kick one person out and we're going to keep one person in, but maybe it's more complex. And really you have to have conversations, and some people are willing to put out a lot of forgiveness and other people are not. And so you're going to have to work, someone's going to have to work through this with a couple, perhaps help them process how they respond, and maybe suggest some changes that they can make, or even some professional counseling or therapy. That might be in order as well. And that might be something that a church can enable. And so it's really, again, it's about maintaining and restoring right relationships. So what can be done to restore a right relationship in this marriage? What can be done so that this couple can relate with each other in the church community in encouraging ways and get the support that they need as they're walking through these situations? Is there abuse that's happening? There's all kinds of different considerations. And some of those questions, if the answer is yes, it takes the severity up a few notches and it changes the way we approach things. Someone inside the church community reveals that he or she is filing for divorce. I've seen churches make this an automatic consequence. I'm sorry, you can no longer be a part of our church fellowship. But do you realize there's 101 reasons why people file for divorce? You don't know why. I say that humbly. You might know a list of reasons why. And you might boil it down to something about, their attitude. But sometimes people are being abused, so they file for divorce. Sometimes people are being petty, so they file for divorce. Sometimes people are being greedy, so they file for divorce. Sometimes people are having affairs, they file. There's so many different reasons. Sometimes people are being neglected, so they file for divorce. And it's a bigger topic. It's always a bigger topic. And so listening, a relationship, and then through that, maybe you see what else needs to happen in the process. But taking immediate action in those types of situations rarely works out well, especially if it's harsh. That results in a lot of harm, a lot of church hurt. Someone in the church community is criticizing others, elevating themselves, and looking to lead. This is another thing that sounds kind of benign, but if you Google those symptoms, you'll come up with narcissism. And you realize that people who are always being critical, people who are always elevating themselves, and people who are looking for positions of power or recognition, that can seriously threaten the church and become so divisive. And I've seen experiences like that where somebody is self-absorbed and that impacts relationships. It's a threat to relationships. And because of that, threat to relationships is something that just can't be ignored because it leads to serious problems. If you recognize those traits, that's a serious thing in a church. Last couple. Someone inside the church community hears that someone outside the church community is abusing his or her child. They're outside the church community, so don't have to say anything, right? Not legally. You do. So report that to the police. Again, it's not your responsibility to prosecute that. The police are not going to take your word for it, but you're going to start a paper trail and perhaps an investigation. And maybe your willingness to share something and say something will be the catalyst for something that changes that child's life ultimately. Someone inside the church community believes someone outside the church community might be physically abusing his or her spouse who's inside the church community. Again, it's somebody outside the church, right? So we let that go. If it's physical abuse, we don't let that go, right? Legally or morally. And so perhaps the church is supportive to the spouse who's a part of it, but also enables that spouse to get the help separation perhaps that's required to take the power away from the abusive person in her life, which is what we learned about last week as well. Last thing, a church leader seems to be ignoring suggestions, controlling decisions, and avoiding accountability. Is that serious, or do you just overlook it? How many people say just overlook it? How many people say that's a red flag, that's serious? It is serious, right? It is serious. That's called spiritual abuse. It's when somebody's trying to control you. They don't have any personal accountability. They want to make all the decisions. And you read stories in the news about these types of leaders. And it may be now, it may be later, but there's a hard fall because it's all about pride. It's very damaging to relationships. Relationships require many people, and if it's all about one person, that's not a relational church. It's like a dictatorship, right? And so I know we took a little bit of time and we went into some details, but I just want to leave you with that because I feel like it's something that's so important. When we look at correction in the church, there's so many different angles, but it all centers around relationships. So I encourage you to make that your focus. Whether this is your home church or someplace totally different, or whether your church isn't your thing now, but you plug in at some point in time in your life. Look for churches that emphasize relationships, not just churches that expect you to follow a list of rules. Look for churches that work hard to preserve those relationships because it may not be easy.